Oscar Piastri takes home his first win of the season while his teammate Lando Norris overcomes a failing brake pedal to secure McLaren's 50th 1-2 finish in the team's history. George Russell takes third for Mercedes' 300th podium. A Sunday to forget for Ferrari as both cars are disqualified after the race. And have we already seen the end of Liam Lawson in a Red Bull? We are about to dive into everything we saw Sunday in Shanghai, all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. McLaren recovers from a tough Saturday and secures its first, and probably not the last, 1-2 finish of the season. Just a very strong performance from Oscar Piastri. He of course starts on pole, and as we learned from Saturday, the start of the race is crucial at this track. And maybe Oscar doesn't have the best start, but he had a good enough start to hold on to that lead over George Russell, over his teammate Lando Norris coming out of the first few turns. And after that, it was his day, and it was his race to lose. And Oscar showed a lot of poise as he really controlled the race from start to finish and held the lead for basically the entirety of the race, other than a few laps during the pit stops. But this was the performance that Oscar needed, especially after the disappointments in Australia last weekend, and also what Oscar needed just to make up some of that ground that he lost in the Drivers' Championship last weekend. But a very strong performance by Oscar, and a very calm and somewhat uneventful race for him, but a much, much trickier race for his teammate Lando Norris, who also had an excellent start, getting ahead of George Russell at the start, which set him up for this P2 finish. He did get a little help from Piastri, blocking George Russell going into the first turn, which allowed Lando to make a run on George around the outside. But after that, it was the McLarens out front, and they were controlling the race and controlling the pace, and really looked in a very, very strong position as this race continued on. But then the pit stops came, and things started to get a little bit interesting for Lando. He was just in the unfortunate position of being the second McLaren car and having George Russell close enough behind him to capitalize on the undercut. And that's exactly what happened. Oscar and George box on lap 14. Of course, Lando has to stay out one extra lap, but he loses enough time in that one lap where when he does come into the pits and switches onto the hard tires, he comes out pretty even with George Russell. But George had the advantage of having the warmer tires, but also had Lance Stroll right there too to cause some traffic for Lando. This allowed George to get around Lando with a pretty nice move heading into the first couple turns. But a lot of credit goes to Lando for saving this situation, for not only getting around Lance Stroll on his outlap, but also keeping up with George and eventually passing him 2 laps later. We saw Saturday, and we saw today, just how tricky it can be to follow cars, and not only follow them in their dirty air, but have enough speed to get around them and make an overtake. So for Lando to do this in this moment, only took a two laps for him to get around George, was huge for him, securing this P2 finish. That wasn't the only big moment for him, though. Another big moment came for Lando around lap 24, where at the time he only had a second and a half lead over the Mercedes of George Russell. And at the time, it looked like we were headed towards a second round of pit stops. So the McLaren pit wall starts to get a little bit concerned that Lando's going to get undercut again by the Mercedes, and tells Lando to push the car and extend that lap. And that's what happens, and that's what Lando does. And he responds and stretches his lead over George to 5 seconds over the next 10 laps. Now, of course, this didn't matter as much as expected because everyone ended up staying out for the rest of the race and sticking to a one-stop strategy. But this gave McLaren and gave Lando a huge safety net to be able to react to whatever the cars behind them decided to do with their pit strategies. So again, things calmed down for Lando, but start to get interesting starting on lap 48, where Lando starts to have issues with his brake pedal going long, which basically means he had to push harder and harder on the brake pedal to get the car to stop. It seemed like a manageable issue at first, but then his race engineer, Will Joseph, radios in and says, "Hey, Lando, this is critical for the last few laps." And Lando basically had to coast around the track to just make it to the end of the race. Now, there's no doubt that George would have caught him if this race were just one lap longer. And George almost caught him at the end of the final lap. But just a gutsy performance by Lando to manage this issue with the brake pedal and not only make it to the end of the race, but make it to the end still maintaining that P2 position. And while all of this is happening, Oscar Piastri is out in front, as comfortable as can be, just cruising to a victory. So again, just a huge, huge performance by Oscar, especially after last weekend. And there just wasn't a doubt at any point in the race that Oscar wasn't going to come home with the race win. McLaren looks strong after these first two rounds, and they're in a very, very good position, not only with the Drivers' Championship, but with the Constructors' Championship as well, where you look at the other top competitive teams, Ferrari's struggling more than expected. Red Bull only has Max as a competitive driver, and Mercedes is really being carried by George Russell's performances at this point. Of course, Kimi Antonelli isn't doing terrible, but you can tell he's still getting used to the car and just driving at this level of Formula One. So a very, very strong weekend for McLaren, especially considering what we saw from them at the beginning of the weekend, where it looked like they might not win this race. It might not come away with these points finishes. So exactly what McLaren needed from this weekend, and really a strong performance that sets them up in a very good position heading into the rest of the season. But outside of McLaren, some of the biggest news from the race came well after the checkered flag was waved with Ferrari. Charles Leclerc originally finishes P5, Lewis Hamilton originally finishes P6, but after the race, both cars are referred to the stewards, and both cars end up getting disqualified from the race, along with Pierre Gasly's Alpine. Charles Leclerc was disqualified for the car being underweight. The team released a statement saying this was due to excessive tire wear because of the unexpected one-stop strategy, which you do understand to an extent, but still a huge error by Ferrari. And at the same time, almost everyone else did a one-stop. So why did they get it right and why did Ferrari get it wrong? Now, Lewis's disqualification was a little bit different. His was for excessive wear on the skid block underneath the car. In the same statement released by the team, they said Lewis's problem was just a misjudgment on the car's ride height heading into the race. Again, another mistake that just should not happen for this team. And mistakes that have happened with this team in the past, and you would think they would have learned from, but clearly have not. But even outside of the disqualifications, just not a great race for Ferrari. Charles and Lewis both have that moment at the start of the race where Lewis clips the front wing of Charles and damages the front wing, taking off the end plate. Probably more Leclerc's fault than anyone, but at the end of the day, just a lap one racing incident where you really can't put too much blame on either driver for that happening. But interestingly, Leclerc still had very good pace in that car with the broken wing, and it looked like it actually helped him with his tires. Verstappen ended up catching both of the Ferraris by the end of it, but it was very surprising after that broken wing incident happened to see Leclerc really have stronger pace than Max for most of the race, and a stronger pace than Lewis for the entirety of the race, even with that compromised wing. And Lewis, he just didn't have the pace today, which was very strange considering how strong he looked on Saturday in that sprint race, coming away with the win. Now, Lewis did make the additional pit stop on lap 38, which did hurt his race a little bit, but this was a low-risk, high-reward move, and you understand Ferrari making this call, where right before the pit stop, Max was catching up to Lewis. He was going to pass him. It was inevitable. And Lewis, coming into the pits, only lost that one position to Max, so it really didn't hurt him too much. But even after that pit stop, you expected Lewis to have much stronger pace than all of the other top cars and catch at least back up to Leclerc and to Verstappen, and it just didn't happen. So it's very concerning for this team that they have these fluctuations in the car's performance, and they're still just trying to figure out the right working window for this car. And it would have been a tough Sunday for this team without the disqualifications, but the ultimate result really made this a weekend to forget for Ferrari. And they have a lot of ground to make up. If they want to compete for either championship this season, they have certainly dug themselves into a hole with these first two races. Now, more big news came out after the checkered flag, this time with Liam Lawson and Red Bull. Originally a P15 finish for Liam, which became a P12 after the disqualifications, but not the result he needed from this race, or the result that Red Bull wanted to see from him. Isaac Hadjar finishes ahead of him. Yuki Tsunoda would have finished ahead of him if it wasn't for a bizarre broken wing situation, but not what Liam needed at all. But the comments have officially started from Red Bull's management, putting Lawson's future with the team in doubt. It started on Saturday after qualifying. Of course, Liam qualifies dead last in P20. Helmut Marko was asked after qualifying if Lawson should be replaced, and his response didn't necessarily rule it out and basically just said, F1 is a competitive sport, so not what you would want to hear from him if you're Liam Lawson. But this continued Sunday after the race, where Christian Horner made comments basically saying that he hopes Liam responds accordingly to the pressure. And again, reiterating that F1 is a competitive sport and there's always pressure on you. But now we have reports coming out that Red Bull might even swap Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda for the next race in Japan. And they're having an emergency meeting this week back at the team's facility in Milton Keynes to discuss the team's direction and future with their driver lineup. This is happening a lot faster than expected, but the team has pressure to have a competitive driver next to Max with the way Max is performing in this car. And we have seen it happen time after time with this Red Bull team. So there's really no question about it. If Liam is given more opportunities to race for this team, he has to produce, and he has to produce now. The leash is very short, if there's even a leash at all with him, and he has zero room for error at this point. Now, the expectation that is that if this does happen, the team would swap Yuki and Liam, putting Yuki in the Red Bull, putting Liam in the Racing Bull. But now we've gotten more reports that the team is considering loaning Franco Colapinto from Alpine and putting him in a Racing Bull, which would mean Liam is out of a seat completely. Now, I will be surprised if this does happen, and I'd even be surprised if Liam is taken out of the Red Bull seat before the next race. But if things continue like this, a move is bound to happen at some point during the season. Again, I would be very surprised if Colapinto ends up in a Racing Bull. There are just too many logistics with his contract, and I don't think Alpine would be too quick to give up Colapinto from what we've seen from Jack Doohan this year. I think they like having Colapinto just as a safety net in case they themselves have to make a driver swap. But swapping Yuki and Liam would probably be the easiest move for the Red Bull teams. But the message is clear. Liam Lawson must perform, and he must perform quickly, or else he's out. I want to touch on a few other teams before we move to the winners and losers of the weekend. A huge day for Haas and Williams. Double points finishes for both after the disqualifications. For Haas, P5 for Esteban Ocon, P8 for Ollie Bierman. For Williams, a P7 finish for Alex Albon and a P10 for Carlos Sainz, making it his first points finish with his new team. Just a huge result for both in terms of the constructor standings for the midfield teams. Starting with Haas, I came away from this race very impressed with Ollie Bierman. He made a handful of overtakes going into turn 14 on Liam Lawson, Jack Doohan, and Carlos Sainz. Had another impressive overtake on Pierre Gasly heading into turn 1. But you could just see the confidence building with him as this race went on, especially with his ciao radio messages anytime he made an overtake. But this was the Ollie Bierman performance you expected based on what we saw from him last year in the Ferrari and those few races we saw from him in the Haas. A much more impressive result for his teammate Esteban Ocon finishing in P5, but just a more quiet race for him in terms of the broadcast and how much was shown for him. But just a great job managing the race and getting this car into a strong points finish for the team. And overall for Haas, just a huge bounce back weekend for the team after a terrible race in Australia where both cars finished last out of the cars that actually finished the race. So a huge, huge result for both of these Haas drivers. Now for Williams, more of a quiet day for them in terms of the broadcast. We really didn't hear anything about either driver other than those few laps where Alex Albon was in the lead just because he was one of the last cars to box. But at the end of the day, P7 and P10 was the result that this team needed. Surprisingly, though, Alex Albon has now outperformed Carlos Sainz in every qualifying in every race this season. Not what anyone expected with Sainz's resume coming over from Ferrari, but I think this says more about Alex Albon's abilities as a driver than Carlos Sainz's struggles adapting to the car. I do think Carlos will have his day, and I do think he will catch up. He's probably still just getting used to this car and getting used to this team. Now, of course, he did need some luck to get into the points with the disqualifications, but again, still the first points finish for Carlos Sainz in a Williams, so certainly something for him to build on moving forward. Going to the Racing Bulls, a disappointing race for them, with both looking like they were headed towards a points finish coming out of qualifying, but it looked like doing a two-stop really ruined the races for both of these drivers. And it seemed like this team was the only team that was really surprised by the possibility of doing a one-stop. Now, Yuki made his first pit stop on lap 12. Isaac Hadjar came in a lap later on lap 13. So they did pit earlier than some of the other cars. You saw most of the other pit stops start on lap 14, continue to lap 15 and 16. So it could have been a decision that compromised the race, coming in a little earlier than expected. But by the time they realized that all the other cars were going for a one-stop, it was probably just too late for this team to really do anything about it. But the pit strategy wasn't the only killer for this team. Yuki Tsunoda had a very weird moment where his front wing just broke out of nowhere and snapped out of nowhere as he was coming down the front straight. Just not something you see at all, especially with this generation of Formula One cars. But of course, this causes him to come in and make a third pit stop, which essentially just ruined any chances that Yuki had of making a recovery drive and getting into the points. Now, if they did manage the pit strategy correctly, I think we probably at least see Isaac Hadjar finish in the points. I do think the broken wing would have compromised Yuki and taken him out of the points regardless of that. And that situation just looks like it was unavoidable regardless of what the pit strategy was. But overall, for this team to miss out on points completely is just a tough, tough result. And an opportunity that they can't afford to miss, especially being a midfield team. Finishing up with my winners and losers of the weekend, starting with the winners, of course, McLaren. Just a very strong result with a 1-2 finish and a very promising result after the struggles we saw with this team on Friday and Saturday. And look, there's just a lot of unknowns that are coming up later in the season. Once teams start bringing upgrade packages, once the rest of the Flexi Wing regulations start in Spain. So it's very important right now for McLaren to capitalize on these moments while they clearly have the better car. And that's exactly what they did today with this 1-2 finish. Another winner of the weekend, or winners of the weekend, Mercedes. P3 for George, P6 for Kimi after the Ferrari disqualifications. Another strong result for George Russell. It may be a little bit unexpected to see him back on the podium again, but what you want to see out of George, especially at this point in the season. You would have liked to see a little more out of Kimi, but he did get the boost with the Ferrari disqualifications that bumped him up to P6. But with both of these drivers, the consistency that we've seen from the two of them as a pair is probably only second to McLaren. So something that will pay huge dividends in the Constructors' Championship, and they've certainly laid a good foundation with these first two race weekends heading into the rest of the season. Another winner, no surprise here, Max Verstappen. P4 is a very strong result for him in this car, and it's no secret that this car is hard to drive, and we saw even Max struggle with this car at times during this race. He had moments at the beginning of the race where he lacked pace and looked like he was going to fall down the order, but had a very strong second half of the race that allowed him to catch up and pass both of the Ferraris. Now, it's hard to see Max really fighting for a championship this year based on what we've seen from the car so far, but he still looks very capable of at least keeping this car close to the top. Another winner, we talked about them a second ago, but Haas, again, just a huge points finish for both of the drivers. It is early, but Haas is now 6th in the constructor standings and only 3 points behind Williams and Ferrari, who are ahead of them. There's a long way to go in this season, but the team laid down a very good foundation with the points they earned today, and that should really help them as the season progresses. Same situation for Williams with a double points finish that keeps them in 4th place in the constructor standings, and it did not look like their weekend on Friday and Saturday. And of course, they did need some luck during the race to get this double points finish, but they had their cars in positions to capitalize on this moment, and that's exactly what they did. So a very strong result for Williams coming out of this weekend. My last winner of the weekend, we didn't talk much about him, but Lance Stroll had a very different strategy than others, starting on the hard tires and switching to the mediums. But we saw a lot of good things from him today. especially driving defensively and keeping cars behind him, or at least giving them enough of a headache to slow them down. The interesting thing with him, though, is Lance Stroll has now finished in the top 10 in every race this season, including the sprint race. So a very strong start to the season for him, and hopefully something that will help him build a lot of momentum heading into the rest of the season. Moving to the losers, of course, starting with Ferrari. Just not a good start to the season for this team at all. They are now 5th in the constructors' standings. Lewis and Charles are now 9th and 10th in the driver's standings, respectively. Not what you expected 2 races in for a team that had such high championship hopes coming into the season. Now, again, there's a long way to go, and they have plenty of time to recover from this, but Ferrari has really dug themselves into a hole after these first 2 race weekends. Another loser of the weekend, no surprise here, Liam Lawson. There's still a chance, or there is a chance, it could already be over for him. But if it's not over, the clock is certainly ticking for his future at Red Bull. Look, it's just the Red Bull way. If you don't perform, the team will not have the patience to put up with it. And Liam needed a strong race, and he just didn't produce that. We might get an answer sooner rather than later as to how all of this plays out with Liam and Yuki and maybe Franco Colapinto, but you have to be worried about Liam Lawson's future heading into Japan. Another loser of the weekend, we didn't talk much about them either, but Alpine. Of course, Pierre Gasly also was disqualified from the race for the car being underweight. Not as unfortunate as it was for the Ferraris, but still, with the Ferrari disqualifications, that would have put Gasly into the points if they didn't make this mistake. So still a tough mistake for them to swallow. And going to his teammate, it wasn't the worst weekend for Jack Doohan, but still not the result that he needed. He did show some promise with his ability to defend against other cars, but made some pretty bad mistakes too, and received a 10-second penalty for one of those mistakes, which made this even worse for him. Now, Liam Lawson might be a saving grace, because if Franco Colapinto is put into one of the Racing Bulls, that could take a lot of pressure off of Jack Doohan and give him a little more breathing room to get more comfortable with his car. But if that doesn't happen, this was not the result that Jack needed coming out of this race. So overall, just a very tough weekend for Alpine. Going to Sauber, another loser of the weekend. Gabriel Bortoleto had that spin on the first lap that really ruined any chances for him for a solid performance for this race. But the Sauber was just the slowest car on track this weekend. Now, Yuki finished behind them overall, but that was really only because of his broken wing situation. So without that, these 2 cars would have finished dead last out of the cars that did finish the race. But just a disappointing result for this team after that points finish for Nico Hülkenberg last weekend. So you hope they can bounce back from Japan, but if we're all being honest with each other, this is still the result that probably Sauber expected, but still a tough one for them to swallow. My last loser of the weekend, Fernando Alonso, had the unfortunate brake failure right away on lap 4, which caused him to retire, but the second straight retirement for him. So 2 races, 2 retirements, not the start he was hoping for at all. The good news, though, for Fernando is Stroll has shown this car to have some pace. So you do hope that he can turn it around, but you do have to wonder. We've seen it plenty of times with Fernando when he's not in a competitive car and things don't start to not go his way. He really starts to mail it in. So you hope that doesn't happen with this team, with this season. But again, not the start that he hoped for heading into this season. All right, that will do it for the Chinese Grand Prix recap. I will be back at least in a couple weeks for the Japanese Grand Prix, sticking to the same format, an episode on Saturday recapping what we've seen throughout the weekend up to that point and previewing the race for Sunday, and then another episode on Sunday recapping the Japanese Grand Prix. I will be keeping my eyes on this whole Liam Lawson situation, though. So if we do get some news, if we do get some driver movement, there's a chance we might have a surprise episode. So be on the lookout for that in the next couple weeks. But thank you again to everyone for tuning in and listening as we recap another exciting weekend in Formula One. Till next time.